I paid you to save the kitchen patch. Be gone before first light. Jonah Mercer said it without turning around. His boots were planted on the porch boards, his shoulders squared toward the prairie, as if the woman behind him were just another task he meant to finish before dark. The light was draining out of the valley. Wind moved through the bunch grass in long silver waves. Everything about him looked practiced. The flat voice, the shut posture, the habit of dismissing people before they could stay. The woman standing behind him did not leave. "My name is Niska Cardinal," she said. That made him pause, but only for a breath. "Jonah," he answered. "There's stew in the pot. You can sleep in the tack shed." Then he stepped inside and closed the door. Niska remained beside the dying garden, listening to the hinge settle. Rejection did not surprise her. Her mother had heard it from priests. Her grandmother had heard it from clerks with treaty papers. Her uncles had heard it from mounted men who told them to move along and call it law. Calm voices, clean words, cruel outcomes. The valley had been taken that way long before she was born. Still, she had come because the ground had pulled at her for months. At dusk she crossed to the kitchen patch and knelt between rows that had failed under Jonah's care. Beans that never climbed, onion tops gone yellow, a strip of sage that had come up thin and bitter. She pressed both palms into the soil. Warmth hit her first, not heat from the sun, something deeper, held, human. Her chest tightened so suddenly she forgot to breathe. The dirt smelled like rain trapped under roots, like willow bark, like old smoke. Under her hands the ground felt less dead than waiting, and from somewhere far inside memory she heard her grandmother's voice. "They did not take the valley in one battle, girl. They took it with papers no hungry family could read." Niska shut her eyes, and the land opened. Before fences, her people had camped along this bend of water each spring. They did not speak of owning it. They belonged to it, the way birds belong to wind. Children learned which roots healed fever, which reeds told weather, which ridges carried prayer fastest at dawn. The dead were returned to the same soil that had fed them. Nothing was separate. Then came the wagons, the survey chains, the men who smiled while they translated half a promise and wrote down a whole theft. Treaty talk became boundary lines. Boundary lines became removal. Removal became hunger, and hunger made every lie easier to force. When the first families refused to leave, their lodges were torn down. Storehouses were emptied. Horses were taken for order. Later came mission wagons and school ledgers, and the shears that turned children into strangers to their own reflections. Language was beaten out. Names were shortened, twisted, replaced. A world could be stripped without killing everybody in it. That was the cleverness of empire. Niska opened her eyes. The garden was quiet. The sky had gone purple. The ranch house stood above her on the rise, dark against the last band of light. But under her hands, the soil still throbbed with the same impossible familiarity, and for the first time since arriving, she understood why she could not simply leave by morning. This land knew her before the man in the house did, and somewhere beneath the roots, it was trying to tell her why. Jonah Mercer told himself he watched her the next morning because he did not trust strangers around his place. That was the excuse he used when he stood at the window with coffee cooling in his hand, following her movements in the yard. By noon, he knew it was a lie. Niska did not work the garden the way other hired hands did. She never attacked the ground. She listened to it. She loosened the top layer with a bone-handled trowel, broke clods in her palms, smelled them, shifted stones aside instead of kicking them clear. Where Jonah had spent 2 seasons forcing seed into stubborn dirt, She moved as if she were coaxing the truth out of it. She found the buried rot in the bean row. She turned ash into the cold patch near the fence. She cut back the dead heads of the sage and murmured something under her breath that sounded less like a prayer than a greeting. By evening, the whole place looked different. Not transformed, not miraculous. Alive. That unsettled him more than if she had failed. She caught him staring once and straightened, wiping her hands on her skirt. "This patch was worked before your house was built," she said. Jonah frowned. "My father broke this ground." "No," Niska said. "He used it. That isn't the same." Something in the certainty of her voice made the old warning rise in him before he could stop it. His grandfather had said it for years, whenever the boys took shovels too close to the garden after rain. "Not there. Not deep. Leave that strip alone." Jonah had always assumed the old man meant rusted wire, a collapsed pit, some frontier hazard half forgotten. Families collected strange rules like they collected scars. You inherited them without the story. Now, watching Niska brush soil from a flat stone half hidden under carrot tops, he was no longer so sure. That night they ate at opposite ends of the table while the lamp hissed softly between them. "You speak like you know this place," Jonah said. "I know what stolen ground feels like," Niska replied. He should have ended the conversation there. Instead, he asked, "Your people were from here?" Niska's face did not harden. It hollowed. "My mother's mother was born downriver," she said. "Her father was shot beside a willow spring when the family refused to move. The camp was burned. The children who lived were marched north. Some were sent farther east to the mission schools. My aunt came back with a number in a ledger and a language she was afraid to speak out loud." The room seemed to shrink around the words. Jonah had heard versions of this kind of history before, mostly from men who said it with a shrug, like weather already gone past. Hearing it at his table, from a woman whose hands still carried his own garden dirt beneath the nails, was different. It removed the safe distance. Outside, wind rattled the eaves. Niska gathered the empty bowls and rose. As she passed the door, a splintered twig that had caught in her braid brushed free and fell. Jonah bent to pick it up, then stopped with it in his hand. "You have a burr caught lower down," he said quietly. "May I?" She turned, surprised by the question itself more than the request. After a moment, she nodded. Jonah reached only once, carefully, easing the hooked seed from where it had tangled in the end of her long black braid. He let it rest in his palm, like evidence of something fragile he had nearly mishandled. "Thank you," she said. He stepped back at once. The next days settled into a rhythm neither of them trusted enough to name. She worked the patch, then the herb beds, then the neglected strip near the root cellar where nothing had grown for years. He fixed fence, hauled water, and found himself arranging his tasks to pass close enough for conversation. The town noticed before either of them admitted anything had changed. At Dawson's store, a lawyer named Whitcomb remarked that Mercer had taken to keeping unusual company. At the livery, a ranch hand asked whether Jonah planned to hand over his place 1 acre at a time. Men laughed. Women lowered their eyes. The old frontier way of punishing moral uncertainty was not always gunfire. Often it was ridicule first, pressure second, violence if needed. Jonah went home with his jaw tight and his temper worse. Niska was in the garden when he returned, kneeling at the edge of the row by the root cellar, fingers pressed into a seam in the earth. "There's stone here," she said without looking up. Not fieldstone, set stone. Jonah stared at the ground his grandfather had forbidden. The wind shifted, and for the first time in his life, he was afraid of what might be buried under his own house. The storm broke after midnight. Not a polite prairie rain, but the kind that split the sky open and made the whole valley sound temporary. Thunder rolled over the ridge in great iron waves. Wind struck the outbuilding so hard the tack shed door banged loose from its latch. Jonah woke to the smell of wet dust and the sense that something was missing. Niska. He found the shed empty. By the time he reached the garden, rain had already turned the rows to black-ribboned mud. Lightning flashed, and in that white rupture of light, he saw her on her knees near the root cellar strip, both hands buried to the wrists in the ground, as if she were trying to pull a body free from below. "Ska!" She did not answer. Another blast of lightning lit the garden. Her face was streaked with rain and mud, and something rawer than either. Recognition. She struck the ground once with the heel of her hand, then clawed the soaked soil aside. A stone emerged. It was upright, not natural, its top curve worn smooth by decades underground. On one face, half choked with mud, a carved mark cut through the surface. Not a settler survey notch, but an older boundary sign, deliberate and human, and placed there long before Jonah Mercer's family fenced a single acre. Niska touched it and folded over like the contact had gone straight through bone. The visions came in fragments, but they came hard. Men on horseback shouting through smoke, women dragging children toward the creek, a willow lodge falling inward under flame, an elder with his hands open, refusing to run. The shot. The silence after. Jonah did not see those things as she did, but he saw enough in her face to understand that this was no superstition and no performance. The storm had not created the truth. It had uncovered it. His shovel hit iron before dawn. They dug in the rain until the earth gave up a rusted lockbox, no bigger than a Bible case. Jonah pried it open under the porch lantern, while water ran from his sleeves. Inside lay a rolled survey map, 2 mission school intake pages, a deed transfer witnessed 3 weeks after the valley's removal order, and 1 folded note in his grandfather's hand. Clear the camp before inspectors arrive. Move the bodies if you must. No talk of the spring. For a moment, Jonah could not feel his hands. The porch, the lamp, the rain, the whole familiar architecture of his life seemed to step away from him. He had grown up beneath the weight of Mercer's stories. Hard men, hard winters, hard-won land. That was the inheritance. That was the myth. But the note in his hand was not hardship. It was administration of violence, efficient, ordinary, signed by blood and filed under survival. Niska stood beside him, shivering in wet clothes, eyes fixed on the papers. "This is how they did it," she said. "Not only with bullets, with records, with silence kept in boxes." Jonah wanted to deny it. He wanted one hole in the story, one excuse large enough to crawl through. Misunderstanding. Context. Another family's papers. Anything. But the map matched the ridge. The mission intake pages named children from the very band his grandfather had said passed through wild and hungry. The note was written in the same slanted hand he had seen all his life in branding tallies and seed lists. Behind them the storm went on, indifferent. By morning, the valley knew. Word did not travel cleanly. It never does. By the time Whitcomb rode out with 2 other men, the story had already been bent into accusation. Mercer had gone soft. Mercer was being tricked. Mercer was about to lose his place to an Indian woman who knew how to cry on command. The lawyer did not begin with outrage. He began with practicality. "Bury the box again," Whitcomb told him. "Burn the paper if you must. There is no good that comes from digging up grief no court can settle." Niska looked at Jonah, not pleading, not performing hope, only measuring him. This was the darkest point, not because the proof was weak, but because it was strong. Strong enough to cost him everything. Strong enough to force choice. Jonah looked at the lockbox, then at the boundary stone standing in the mud like a tooth of truth forced up through the earth. "My family kept this buried," he said. Then he turned to Whitcomb. "I won't." Once Jonah refused silence, the valley stopped letting either of them rest. The evidence did not end with the box. It multiplied. Niska sent word through kin networks and mission survivors. An old woman 2 settlements over remembered the Willow Spring and the burned camp. A former clerk produced a copy of a relocation register with names that matched the school intake pages. Jonah found a false acreage amendment in the county archive, filed months after the original transfer and backdated to look clean. Every document made the same argument in a different language. The valley had not been honorably settled. It had been cleared. Publicly, Jonah petitioned to strike the Mercer name from the property record and restore the valley's older translated name, Red Willow Bend. Privately, the pressure became vicious. Fence rails were cut. 2 calves disappeared. A bottle broke against the porch one night with a note wrapped around the neck. "You can sleep with guilt or with savages, not both." Jonah burned the note without comment, but Niska saw the tremor in his hand. Their bond deepened not in speeches, but in labor. They sat up late under lamplight, reading affidavits and church ledgers. Niska spoke the missing children's names aloud before they copied them. Jonah learned to stop reaching for quick absolution. She did not need his shame performed beautifully. She needed him to stay when staying became expensive. One evening, exhausted from sorting papers, Niska loosened the ribbon from her braid and let the long, dark weight of her hair fall over one shoulder. Jonah looked away at once, then back. "What?" she asked, almost smiling. "I was thinking," he said slowly, "that your hair looks like the creek after rain, dark until the light finds it." The compliment surprised her into silence. A week later, when wind knots left the end of her braid tangled after a hard ride back from town, she handed him the ribbon without a word. He stood behind her on the porch and retied it carefully, fingers unsteady from the knowledge that trust can feel more intimate than desire. Nothing in the moment was possessive. That was why it mattered. At the hearing, Whitcomb argued order, precedent, paperwork. Answered with memory, testimony, burial sketches, and the boundary stone itself, hauled in on a wagon bed. Jonah read his grandfather's note into the record with a voice that nearly failed on the final line. People in the room looked away, not because they doubted him, because they believed him. The ruling did not undo the dead. No court could. But it did what such systems rarely do unless forced. It admitted theft into the record. The valley would be held under a shared stewardship charter, with burial protection, use rights, and the Mercer claim renamed Red Willow Bend. It was not justice in full, but it was truth made official. That mattered. They married the following summer in open grass above the creek, barefoot, with witnesses from both sides and the boundary stones set upright nearby, no longer hidden. The wind was warm. The children who ran between the guests knew the valley by its restored name before they knew the old lie. For a while, that felt like enough. Then a year passed. No child came. One quiet evening, Niska sat on the porch with both hands folded over her skirt, watching the revived garden below. The beans climbed now. Sage had returned strong. Red poppies nodded at the fence line. Everything they touched seemed to live, except the one hope she had not admitted frightened her. "It has been a year," she said at last. "What if my blood came home too late?" Jonah took her hand, but gently, as if grief were something skittish that might bolt if handled too fast. "This land was starved," he said. "It still learned how to grow again." She lowered her head. For the first time since the ruling, neither truth nor love felt like enough to answer the ache between them. Jonah did not answer her fear with certainty. He answered it with patience. A week later, he rode north to fetch a healer Niska trusted, an older Cree-Métis woman named Marguerite Delorme, whose knowledge moved between herbcraft, birthwork, and the harder skill of reading the burdens people carry in silence. She arrived with saddlebags full of cedar, dried raspberry leaf, willow bark, and the sort of calm that makes a room tell the truth. She examined Niska without haste, asked about sleep, bleeding, winter losses, hunger years. Mission grief carried second hand through blood. The body, she said, does not divide history as neatly as courts do. "This is not a punishment," Marguerite told her, "and it is not emptiness. Some bodies wait until they believe the world will keep what they create." She prepared teas, tinctures, a bitter root mixture for strength. She made Jonah change the porch door so it no longer slammed in hard wind, saying women should not have to flinch inside their own homes while waiting for new life. She sent them walking at dusk instead of speaking every fear aloud at night. Healing, in her way, was practical. The first sign came in spring, morning with tears bright in her eyes and laughter struggling to keep up with them. Jonah knew before she spoke. When she placed his hand against her belly, he bent over it as if listening for hoofbeats from a long distance away. The pregnancy did not erase the valley's history. Nothing so easy would have been true. There were still graves by the willow spring, still names missing from school rolls, still families who had not had their own child carried back to them by luck or law or love. But new life entered that reality without pretending it was simple, and because of that, it felt earned. Their daughter arrived at the end of summer while thunder walked softly beyond the far ridge, and the garden stood high and green outside the window. Marguerite caught her first cry in both hands. Niska held the child to her chest and wept with a relief that seemed older than either mother or infant. Jonah, who had once believed loneliness was safer than tenderness, looked at the small dark head against Niska's skin, and understood that continuity can break a man open more cleanly than grief. They named her Rose of the Willow, in English, on the church paper, and kept the older family name for home. Years later, people would still tell the story wrong if nobody corrected them. They would say the rancher gave the land back because he fell in love. They would say love healed the wound. They would say the valley was saved by kindness. That was never the full truth. The wound opened because the truth was dug up. The record changed because silence failed. Love survived there because respect came first. And the child lived there because the land was finally allowed to remember itself out loud. Sometimes, near sunset, Jonah would sit on the porch and watch Niska move through the garden with their daughter trailing behind her through the rows. He would remember the first night he told her to be gone by morning, and the shame of how easy the words had come. Now the door stayed open longer. Now the valley had its name back. Now the house stood on land that no longer had to lie about who it knew. And every time the little girl laughed in the wind, Red Willow Bend answered.